a scream in the woods, a secret buried beneath the fog. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Vela. This community is amazing. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your voices make this mystery come alive. Let's dive in. It was a glorious summer afternoon in the village of Little Brinford, the sort of day that seemed spun from honey and laughter. The annual garden fete at the manor house was in full bloom, literally and socially. Tables groaned beneath the weight of sponge cakes, trifles and delicate cucumber sandwiches, while laughter drifted lazily through the rose-scented air. At the heart of the fete, Mrs. Mildred Pomeroy, the vicar's wife and undisputed arbiter of village decorum, presided over the raffle table with benevolent tyranny. Children darted about chasing bunting that fluttered like butterflies, and a brass band struck up a spirited rendition of Rule Britannia near the gazebo. Among the attendees sat Miss Jane Marple, quietly enjoying her tea beneath a striped parasol. Her lace gloves rested neatly on her lap, and her blue eyes, deceptively mild, observed everything. She saw how Mrs. Cartwright avoided meeting her husband's gaze, how young Peter Lacey's shirt collar was slightly askew from a hurried dressing, and how the local doctor's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. To Miss Marple, such things were not idle details, but rather threads in the great tapestry of human nature, a tapestry that always, inevitably, contained a flaw. The fete's highlight came just before 3 o'clock, the announcement of the best homemade preserve. There was the usual flurry of excitement as jars were lined up, gleaming like jewels in the sun. Mrs. Agnes Harcourt, the manor's elegant but aging hostess, approached the judging table to applause. She was a formidable woman, tall and regal, with a reputation for both generosity and an acid tongue. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with her usual crisp authority, "it gives me great pleasure." But the pleasure was never expressed, for in that very instant, as she lifted the winning jar of strawberry jam to inspect it against the light, Mrs. Harcourt staggered, gave a soft gasp, and collapsed to the ground. A hush fell. The band stuttered to silence. Then came the shrieks. Dr. Latham rushed forward, kneeling beside the fallen woman. A moment later his face went pale. "She's gone," he murmured gravely. "Dead." The crowd recoiled. Mrs. Pomeroy clutched her pearls. "Good heavens, what on earth happened?" Someone whispered about a bee sting. Another muttered about heat stroke. But Miss Marple, her teacup poised delicately mid-air, frowned ever so slightly. She had noticed something no one else had. The faint smear of red along the rim of Mrs. Harcourt's glass, and the curious absence of the jam jar's lid. In the distance, the whispering began, as it always does in villages like Little Brinford, and though no one could know it then, that afternoon would mark the beginning of the Whispering Woods murder mystery. Would you like me to continue with part 2? The village reacts next, focusing on gossip, early suspicions, and the first hint of hidden secrets. The village of Little Brinford did not sleep easily that night. By evening, the summer light had dulled to a heavy grey, and the news of Mrs. Harcourt's sudden death had spread through the lanes like wildfire. Curtains twitched, kettles boiled endlessly, and every sitting room hosted its own theory. At the Rose and Crown, the local inn, the talk was loud and certain, too certain, as it always was when the truth was far away. Heart attack. That's all it was, declared Mr. Barnes, the butcher thumping the bar for emphasis. Happens every year with this blasted heat. Heart attack. My foot, replied Mrs. Pomeroy, whose voice carried even when she tried to whisper. "Did you see her face? That wasn't heat stroke, it was poison. And if you ask me, that jam jar had something to do with it." Miss Marple, who happened to be passing the window on her way home from the fete, caught that remark and paused. She had been turning the day's events over in her mind with quiet precision. It was not that she enjoyed tragedy, far from it, but human nature revealed itself most plainly in moments of crisis. She recalled the instant before Mrs. Harcourt fell. The way Mrs. Cartwright had turned sharply toward the tea-table, the tremor in young Peter Lacey's hand as he refilled his glass, and how Dr. Latham's eyes had flicked not to the victim, but to something on the tablecloth near her chair. Tiny details, yet Miss Marple had long known that the smallest gestures could speak the loudest truths. When she reached her gate, she was met by Inspector Graves, a stout, capable man who had been called in from the nearby town. He tipped his hat respectfully. "Evening, Miss Marple. You were at the fete, I believe." "I was," she said mildly, unlocking her gate. "A most distressing business, Inspector." He nodded grimly. "The coroner will determine the cause soon enough, but it's looking like poisoning. We found traces of something in the remains of the jam. Arsenic, perhaps. The doctor's running tests." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind quickened. How dreadful! Poor Mrs. Harcourt! She did seem rather fond of winning those competitions. I suppose everyone will be terribly shocked. Shocked, aye. But we'll get to the bottom of it. He hesitated. "Between us, Miss Marple, there's been some talk. They say Mrs. Cartwright brought the jam. I shouldn't listen to gossip, of course, but one can't stop tongues wagging." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "Gossip, Inspector, is like the wind. It may be unpleasant, but it often carries the scent of truth, if one has the patience to discern it." That night, the village lights burned late. Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles steadying her thoughts. She remembered a garden party in St. Mary Mead many years ago, when a jealous wife had hidden her vengeance in something equally innocent. People, she reflected, seldom changed their methods, only their excuses. The next morning brought more commotion. Constables went door to door, and Mrs. Cartwright was seen weeping in her garden, insisting she had used nothing but sugar and berries. Dr. Latham, looking pale and weary, told anyone who would listen that Mrs. Harcourt had complained of dizziness before. But when Miss Marple saw him speaking to Peter Lacey near the post office, his tone was too urgent, too conspiratorial for comfort. She made a mental note. By mid-afternoon, the inquest was announced for the following day, and speculation reached fever pitch. In the grocer's, Mrs. Pomeroy whispered that Mrs. Harcourt had been preparing to cut her nephew Peter out of her will. At the same time, Mr. Barnes insisted he'd heard the doctor owed her a considerable sum of money. Even the vicar's maid had something to add, that she'd seen someone walking near the woods behind the manor shortly before the fete began. The Whispering Woods. It was a name the villagers spoke softly, more out of habit than superstition. The dense copse stood on the edge of the Harcourt estate, its winding paths shaded by centuries-old oaks. Children said the trees murmured secrets when the wind passed through. Miss Marple, ever fond of truth hidden behind fancy, had always suspected that the whispers were simply echoes of people's own misdeeds. That evening, she took a slow walk toward the edge of those woods. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and fading roses. She could see the faint outline of the manor's garden through the trees, the tables still standing, the bunting limp and forlorn. Something glittered faintly near one of the benches. She stooped and found a small silver brooch in the shape of a rose, its clasp bent as though torn away. Miss Marple examined it carefully, slipping it into her handkerchief. It was not Mrs. Harcourt's style. No, this belonged to someone younger. Perhaps someone nervous enough to fidget, to tug at her own clothing while waiting. When she returned home, the church clock struck 9. The village was settling, though unease lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Miss Marple set the brooch beside her knitting basket and poured herself a cup of tea. She thought of Mrs. Harcourt, her pride, her sharpness, her enemies masked as neighbours, and smiled sadly. "People do the strangest things for the smallest reasons," she murmured to herself, "and it's usually the reasons that seem least important that turn out to be the key." Outside, the wind stirred through the branches of the woods, carrying faint whispers across the village once more. The morning dawned pale and mist-laden, as if the village itself had drawn a veil over its eyes to hide from the ugliness that had settled upon it. A hush hung in Little Brinford, that uneasy quiet which follows gossip too swiftly believed. The death of Mrs. Harcourt had turned from tragedy to scandal overnight. By breakfast, everyone knew, or thought they knew, that the jam had been poisoned, and that poor Mrs. Cartwright was at the centre of it all. Miss Marple, seated at her neat breakfast table, spread marmalade on her toast with gentle precision. She had read the early edition of the Brinford Chronicle, which, with its customary restraint, had devoted nearly a full column to the mysterious death at the manor. The article named no suspects, yet its phrasing was such that anyone with eyes could infer the insinuation. Mrs. Cartwright's name hovered between the lines like an unspoken curse. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Graves, hat in hand, looking more weary than before. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you again, but I was hoping you might answer a few questions about what you saw yesterday." "Of course, Inspector. You'll have some tea." He accepted gratefully, sinking into the chair opposite her. "We've confirmed it was poison, arsenic as suspected, mixed into the jam. Not much, but enough to do the job once it reached the bloodstream." Miss Marple poured his tea, watching the swirl of milk as she stirred. "Such things seldom happen by accident, I fear. Has anyone been charged?" "Not yet, but Mrs. Cartwright's looking likely. She admits the jar was hers. Says she made it herself from last summer's berries. Claims she tasted it just that morning, but we've no proof of that." "Poor woman," Miss Marple murmured. She never was a confident sort, always trying to please everyone, never quite succeeding. Graves gave a half-smile. "You know everyone in this village better than I ever could. Do you think she's capable of it?" Miss Marple considered. "Capable? Perhaps not in the way you mean, but desperation can make even gentle souls act strangely. Still, there's something that doesn't fit. Mrs. Cartwright has no reason to wish Mrs. Harcourt harm. On the contrary, she's often spoken with admiration about her. And then, of course, there's the matter of the missing lid." The inspector looked up sharply. "Lid? Yes. The jam jar's lid was gone when Mrs. Harcourt collapsed. I noticed it at once. Curious, isn't it? A tidy table, yet one small thing misplaced." Graves frowned, rubbing his chin. "Could have rolled off. We didn't find it near the table, though. Perhaps taken away by whoever poisoned it, you think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or perhaps by whoever wanted it to seem that way." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple tidied away her breakfast things, her thoughts turning to the silver brooch she had found by the fete tables. She had not yet mentioned it to Graves. It was not that she wished to conceal evidence, but she preferred to be certain before offering conjecture. In her long experience, it was often better to let people talk themselves into revealing what they wished to hide. By midday, she made her way to the post office, where she knew conversation flowed as freely as postage ink. Sure enough, Mrs. Pratt, the postmistress, was leaning across the counter in eager conference with a customer. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice but not her excitement. "I heard the inquests this afternoon. They say the doctor's to give evidence. You'd think he'd know if the poor lady was unwell before all this." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "One would expect so. And such a handsome young man, too. Dr. Latham, isn't he?" Mrs. Pratt sighed. "Handsome and unlucky. His practice hasn't been doing well, you know. Some say Mrs. Harcourt lent him money last year. Imagine if she were planning to call it back." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, that would certainly place him in a rather difficult position. One can quite see how unfortunate circumstances might collide." She left the post office with more questions than answers. The doctor's connection to Mrs. Harcourt had taken on a new significance. Yet there was also young Peter Lacey, the nephew, handsome, impulsive, and perpetually short of money. Miss Marple had seen the faint shadow that crossed his face when Mrs. Harcourt's name was mentioned the previous day. Was it grief or relief? At 3 o'clock, the inquest began in the parish hall. Villagers filled the benches, fanning themselves with programmes, though the air was cool. Inspector Graves presided at the back, his notebook ready. The coroner summarised the findings. Death by arsenic poisoning, administered in strawberry jam consumed at the fete. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Cartwright was called first. Pale and trembling, she swore she had no idea how poison could have entered her preserve. "I made it months ago," she said tearfully. "My husband tasted it only last week. He's fine. I can't imagine." Then came Dr. Latham. His testimony was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mrs. Harcourt was in good health to my knowledge. She had mild palpitations, but nothing serious. The symptoms at the fete, convulsions, discoloration, were consistent with arsenic ingestion." Miss Marple watched closely. The doctor's voice was steady, but his fingers drummed lightly against the rail as he spoke. Nervousness, guilt, or simply discomfort under scrutiny? When Peter Lacey was called, the tension deepened. He confirmed he had spoken with his aunt briefly before the judging. She seemed fine. I was helping arrange the chairs near the table. That's all." Miss Marple noted again his hesitance, the slight tremor when he adjusted his collar. She recalled the brooch. Delicate, feminine, but not of the kind one would expect on a matron like Mrs. Cartwright. Perhaps it belonged to someone close to Peter, someone anxious near the table. After the proceedings ended, the verdict was recorded. Death by poisoning, administered by person or persons unknown. Mrs. Cartwright was not exonerated, but neither was she charged. The inspector would continue his inquiries. The villagers departed in hushed groups, already spinning new tales before they reached their gates. Miss Marple lingered. Outside the hall she approached Dr. Latham, who was lighting a cigarette. "Such a dreadful affair," she said gently. "I can't help wondering, do you think Mrs. Harcourt might have ingested the poison accidentally? Perhaps by handling something contaminated?" He looked at her sharply, then forced a smile. "I doubt it, Miss Marple. Arsenic doesn't simply appear in jam. Someone had to put it there." "Quite so," she replied, her gaze soft but searching. "And one might almost think whoever did so intended not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to do it in public before the entire village. Well, that takes a peculiar kind of malice." He said nothing, but his match trembled slightly as he struck it. Miss Marple tucked that away in her mind. People betrayed themselves not through what they said, but what they could not control. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned home, her garden bathed in gold. She placed the silver brooch on her writing desk and regarded it with quiet satisfaction. It was, she thought, the first thread in a very tangled skein, somewhere between the jam jar, the missing lid, and that little trinket lay the truth, and she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, intended to find it, one small observation at a time. That night, the wind returned to Little Brinford, slipping through the hedgerows and rattling the panes like an old gossip come to collect its due. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting half finished, her eyes fixed on the small silver brooch glinting on the side table. It caught the firelight with a strangely watchful gleam. She turned it over once more in her fingers. The clasp was indeed bent, as though torn hastily away. Such small accidents often spoke volumes. Jewellery, Miss Marple knew, was deeply personal. Women seldom misplaced it without cause, especially not something delicate enough to betray nervous hands. She wondered again whose it might be, and whose it might be. The following morning she went out with the air of a woman attending to ordinary errands. The village appeared to have recovered some of its calm, though the calm was deceptive. Behind every polite greeting and brisk step lay speculation. At the baker's, customers whispered about the inquest. At the greengrocer's they whispered louder. Miss Marple greeted them all kindly, listening without seeming to do so. It was remarkable how people revealed the truth when they thought no one was truly listening. As she passed the vicarage, she caught sight of Mrs. Pomeroy fussing with her roses. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple called pleasantly. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've heard, of course. Mrs. Cartwright's niece, what's her name, Lily something, has been in tears all morning. She says her aunt's too frightened to go out. Can you imagine? The poor thing. Though between you and me, guilt does strange things to the nerves." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple replied softly, "though so does innocence, when it's doubted by everyone." Mrs. Pomeroy blinked, a little flustered. "Well, yes, of course. Still, I always say there's no smoke without fire. Why, only last month I saw Mrs. Cartwright borrowing rat poison from the grocer. Perfectly innocent, she said. It was for the garden. But who's to say?" Miss Marple thanked her, declining tea, and walked on toward the High Street. Her next stop was the doctor's surgery. She had decided quite logically that it was time to return his visit. Dr. Latham looked up from his desk as she entered, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by professional politeness. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "Oh, yes, thank you. I've simply been feeling a touch of stiffness lately. The joints, you know. I thought a tonic might do me good." He nodded, reaching for a notepad. "Quite right. A bit of rest wouldn't hurt either. It's been an exhausting few days for everyone." "Yes," she said mildly, watching as he scribbled something down. "And such a dreadful loss. I keep thinking how brave you were, tending to poor Mrs. Harcourt before the crowd." The doctor paused just slightly before resuming his writing. "One does what one can. It was too late, unfortunately. Still, you knew her so well. I imagine her death must have been quite a shock." "It was," he said after a moment. "She was a complicated woman, generous in her way, but demanding. She lent money easily enough, but she expected gratitude in return. Some people resented that." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often do resent generosity, Doctor. It places them in the debtor's position, and pride is a prickly thing." He looked at her, almost sharply, as though assessing whether her comment carried meaning. Then he relaxed and handed her a small bottle. "Here, take a teaspoon twice a day, and try not to overexert yourself." "Thank you, Doctor." "You're most kind." She left the surgery with more than medicine. The doctor's tone, controlled yet strained, had told her what she needed. He had indeed borrowed money from Mrs. Harcourt, and her death, while unfortunate, had removed a problem he had not yet solved. But whether that made him a murderer was another matter entirely. Miss Marple believed most people capable of pettiness. Far fewer were capable of malice. Later that afternoon, she paid a call to Mrs. Cartwright's cottage. The woman answered the door looking pale and haggard, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple! Oh, you've come! Everyone's been so cruel. They think I killed her. Me!" "My dear Mrs. Cartwright," said Miss Marple, stepping gently inside, "I don't think you capable of hurting anyone, but perhaps you can help me understand a few little things." Mrs. Cartwright wrung her hands. "I'll try. I swear I didn't poison that jam. I made 3 jars, one for the fete, one for us, and one I gave to Lily for her housekeeping lessons. She still has it in her cupboard." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very interesting. And no one's fallen ill from those?" "No. We've eaten half ours already." "Then it seems the poison was not in the jam when you sealed it," Miss Marple said gently, "which means someone must have tampered with it later. Did you happen to leave your entry unattended at the fete?" Mrs. Cartwright frowned, thinking hard. "Well, I did go to fetch more spoons from the refreshment table. Only a minute, I swear. And when you returned, everything looked just as before. Though, I do remember Mrs. Harcourt herself standing nearby, talking to that young lacy fellow. She had such a way of making one feel small. I don't know what she said to him, but his face went white as chalk." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That matched what she had already noticed, the tension between nephew and aunt. And now the missing lid took on a new possibility. If someone had tampered with the jar, they would have needed to remove the lid quickly, perhaps replace it clumsily, or discard it altogether. When Miss Marple left the cottage, the sun was dipping low, painting the cobblestones with long shadows. She walked toward the edge of the village, drawn once again to the woods that bordered the manor. The air there was cool and still, the kind of silence that seemed to listen. She stepped carefully through the undergrowth until she reached the clearing where she had found the brooch. Kneeling, she examined the ground more closely. The grass was flattened in a faint line leading toward the path. Someone had stood there recently, perhaps even argued. A faint glint caught her eye near the base of an oak. She brushed away a few leaves and uncovered a small glass lid, sticky around the rim. It was faintly dusted with sugar crystals and smelled unmistakably of strawberries. Miss Marple wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief and rose, her heart calm but certain. The chain of events was becoming clearer. Someone had come to that spot after the fete began, tampered with the jar, and discarded the lid. The brooch, lost in haste, had marked the moment of guilt. As she turned to leave, she thought of Peter Lacey's trembling hands, the doctor's careful calm, and Mrs. Cartwright's fear. The pieces were aligning like the stitches in her knitting, one thread pulling tight, drawing the pattern into focus. And though she could not yet name the culprit, Miss Marple knew that human nature would in time do the work for her. People always revealed themselves, if one only waited and watched, and Miss Marple was a master at both. The following morning, little Brinford stirred with the brittle cheerfulness that often follows calamity, as though the village believed that by pretending to be ordinary again, it could banish the shadow that hung over it. The postman whistled a tune that faltered when passing the Cartwright cottage. The grocer's bell jingled too loudly, and yet every conversation began and ended with Mrs. Harcourt's name. Miss Marple, however, moved through the day with quiet purpose, her thoughts precise, her manner as gentle as ever. The glass lid now rested in a small paper envelope upon her writing desk, the faint scent of strawberries clinging to it still. She had no intention of presenting it to Inspector Graves just yet, not until she understood precisely what it meant and, more importantly, who had left it behind. Her first call that morning was to the manor itself. The house, now under the supervision of a harried housekeeper and a silent footman, had the air of a place holding its breath. The blinds were drawn halfway, and faint dust motes floated through the narrow shafts of light. When Miss Marple announced herself, the housekeeper, Mrs. Denby, appeared at once, wringing her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm that glad you've come. It's dreadful, dreadful. The master's been beside himself, though of course I suppose he's the master now. Poor young Mr. Peter hardly knows what to do." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, I can quite imagine. Losing a relative is never easy, particularly when circumstances are irregular. Is he at home?" "In the study, miss. But I don't think he'll thank you for calling. He's been quite short-tempered these days." "I dare say grief takes many forms," Miss Marple murmured. "Still, perhaps a friendly word will do him good. She was shown into the study, where Peter Lacey sat slumped behind a desk littered with papers. His dark hair was dishevelled, and his face bore the drawn pallor of sleepless nights. When he looked up, surprise flashed briefly before he composed himself. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid I'm not much company." "I don't require company," she said kindly, taking the chair opposite. "Only conversation. Sometimes it helps to talk." He gave a short, humourless laugh. "Talk? About what? Death, scandal, or the fact that everyone in this village thinks one of us killed her?" "Not everyone," Miss Marple said softly. "There are still those who prefer to understand before they accuse." He looked at her, suspicious but faintly hopeful. "You really think Mrs. Cartwright's innocent?" "I think," she replied, folding her hands, "that guilt seldom sits comfortably on those who wear it unwillingly, and Mrs. Cartwright strikes me as a woman quite incapable of deception." He stared down at his hands. "She didn't do it. I know she didn't, my aunt. She had enemies, Miss Marple. You can't imagine how many." "Oh, I can imagine a good deal," Miss Marple said, her tone almost amused. "She was a woman of strong opinions, I believe." "Strong?" he muttered. "Domineering, more like. She held everything over us. Money, reputation, favours. He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "It sounds dreadful to say, but she could be cruel, always reminding me of my debts, of my failures. Even threatened to cut me off entirely last week." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That must have been very distressing. But I imagine you didn't wish her dead." His head snapped up. "Good God, no. Well, yes, I said things in anger. Everyone does. But I could never—" She nodded gently. "Of course not. You mustn't think I'm accusing you. It's simply that when one wishes to find the truth, one must understand what feelings were in play." He sighed, leaning back. "She was supposed to change her will next month. Dr. Latham was helping arrange it. Perhaps she never got the chance." That caught Miss Marple's attention. "The doctor? My, how very obliging of him." Peter hesitated. He'd been handling some of her affairs. She trusted him, or thought she did. But lately she'd begun to question things. Said he wasn't as careful with her accounts as he should be. I think she meant to confront him after the fete." Miss Marple's knitting mind stitched another quiet loop. Dr. Latham, again, a man under financial strain, tied to the victim by both money and opportunity. Yet something still pricked at her reason. The poison had been in the jam, and that required access, not merely motive. As she rose to leave, Peter's eyes flickered toward the window. "Do you believe in coincidences, Miss Marple? Only when they're useful," she said with a faint smile. He gave a small, uncertain laugh, and she left him to his brooding. Outside, the afternoon sunlight glimmered weakly through the clouds, casting long shadows across the garden. The fete tables had been cleared, but the grass still bore the faint impressions of where they had stood. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the path leading to the woods, her eyes sweeping the ground. A small indentation by the hedge caught her attention. The shape of a woman's heel, smaller than Mrs. Cartwright's, newer than Mrs. Harcourt's. She thought again of the brooch, of the bent clasp, of nervous fingers fumbling near that very place. When she returned home, she found Inspector Graves waiting on her doorstep. He looked tired and irritable, his boots dusted with road grit. "Miss Marple," he said briskly, "I'm afraid we've got another problem. The Harcourt maid's gone missing, packed her bag in the night and vanished." "How very inconvenient," Miss Marple said mildly, ushering him inside. Had she reason to fear for herself, do you think? Hard to say. She was a quiet one, but someone saw her walking toward the woods around dawn. "The woods again," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. "They do seem to draw people in, don't they?" The inspector sighed. "If she's run off, she may know something. I'll have men searching the area this afternoon." As he spoke, Miss Marple glanced at the envelope on her desk. "You might find something curious there, Inspector," she said after a pause. "A discarded jam lid, sticky with strawberry preserve, and found quite near the same place you're about to search. I do believe it may help your men know where to look." His eyes widened. "You found that? Why didn't you say so before?" "Oh, I wasn't sure of its importance. But now that someone else has gone missing, it seems rather more urgent." Graves took the envelope, frowning thoughtfully. "You've a talent for finding what the rest of us miss." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not talent, Inspector, just a habit of watching what people overlook." That evening, as the search parties combed the edges of the Whispering Woods, the village lights glowed faintly against the dusk. From her window, Miss Marple watched the lanterns moving through the trees like small restless stars. Somewhere among those shadows, truth waited, quiet, patient, inevitable, and she knew it would not be long before it whispered back. By dawn, the searchers had returned from the woods, weary and mud-smeared, their lanterns dimmed by mist. The missing maid, Clara Briggs, had been found, not dead, but frightened beyond measure, huddled beneath a fallen tree near the western edge of the Whispering Woods. She was trembling and incoherent, her speech disjointed and feverish. The doctor was called immediately, and by the time Inspector Graves arrived, the girl was lying on a cot in the village hall, wrapped in blankets, her eyes darting wildly toward the door each time it creaked. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner, observed everything without a word. It was nearly 7 when Clara finally managed to speak. "I didn't do nothing," she stammered, her voice raw. "I swear I didn't. I only wanted to get away. It was the eyes. Oh, those dreadful eyes!" "Whose eyes, Clara?" asked the inspector gently, leaning forward. I don't know. Someone was in the garden that night, near the shed, watching. I saw the light flicker through the trees, and then I heard something, metal, scraping. I ran. I didn't look back." She clutched the blanket tighter around her. "They'll say I did it. I know they will. But I only cleaned the table. I never touched the jam." "Not once," Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "You cleaned the table, you say? When was that, my dear?" "The next morning," Clara whispered. "Mrs. Harcourt told me to tidy up before the guests arrived. I set out the spoons and napkins. I saw the jars then. One of them was open a bit. I thought someone had forgotten to tighten the lid." Inspector Graves's gaze sharpened. "Did you tell anyone this?" Clara shook her head. "No one believed me. After she died, everyone looked at me like I'd brought bad luck. I just wanted to leave this awful place." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Her thoughts were turning quickly, aligning themselves like cards in a careful hand. The open jar, the missing lid, the maid's fear. It was all consistent with what she had already suspected. Someone had tampered with the jam in those early hours before the fete, and Clara, poor frightened child, had unknowingly stumbled too near the truth. By mid-morning the village was buzzing again. The discovery of the maid had only deepened the mystery, and the talk now turned to whether she might have been silenced, or nearly so. Dr. Latham emerged from the hall looking grave. "She'll live," he said shortly when asked. "Exhaustion and shock, that's all. But she's not to be questioned further until tomorrow." Miss Marple thanked him with quiet courtesy. "You must be quite fatigued yourself, Doctor. These events are trying for everyone." He gave her a weary smile. "Indeed, I can't seem to find a moment's peace. Every patient, every villager now looks at me as though I hold all the answers, and yet I've none." "I dare say you will," she said mildly, "once the right questions are asked." He looked puzzled at that, but Miss Marple merely inclined her head and walked away, her parasol tapping lightly on the pavement. She had no intention of explaining herself just yet. Her next stop was the grocer's shop, where the young assistant, Lily Cartwright, niece of the accused, was restocking shelves. The girl's eyes were red from crying, but she managed a weak smile when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quivering. "Auntie says you believe her, that you think she didn't do it. Is it true?" "I think your aunt is far too kind-hearted for such wickedness," Miss Marple said gently. "But tell me, my dear, that jar of jam she gave you, do you still have it?" "Yes, ma'am. It's in our pantry. I haven't touched it since the fete." "Would you be so good as to bring it to my cottage later? I'd like to have a look at it. No need to tell anyone just yet." Lily nodded eagerly, grateful for the small flicker of hope. "I will, right after closing." As Miss Marple walked home, she allowed herself the smallest smile. If her instinct was correct, the untouched jar would reveal much. Not through science or chemical tests, but through observation. One could learn a great deal about a person from how they sealed a lid, how they labelled a jar, even how neatly they tied the ribbon around it. Every gesture carried its owner's signature. That afternoon, Inspector Graves called upon her again. He seemed more subdued than before. "We found something else in the woods," he said, lowering his voice. "A small glass bottle half buried in the soil. Label's been peeled off, but it smells of arsenic. Probably the same substance as in the jam." "How very obliging of our culprit to leave such a clue," Miss Marple murmured. "And near the same place where I found the brooch, I presume?" The inspector nodded. "Aye, you were right about that spot. Whoever did this must have panicked, tossed the bottle away after using it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So we have a poison, a discarded lid, and a frightened maid who saw someone in the garden, and yet the village insists upon Mrs. Cartwright's guilt." He sighed. "It's the easiest explanation. Too easy, I suppose, indeed. The easiest explanations usually are." As evening approached, the air grew thick with the scent of impending rain. Lily arrived promptly, clutching the jar in a brown paper parcel. Miss Marple invited her in, offered her tea, and gently unwrapped the package. The jar was identical to the one from the fete. Same label, same handwriting, same red ribbon tied around the lid. Only this one was sealed tight, the wax untouched. Miss Marple turned it slowly in her hands. "How carefully your aunt works," she murmured. "See how the label sits perfectly straight, and the wax smooth as glass. You can tell she poured it herself, not hurriedly. A tidy worker always leaves her mark." She set the jar beside the envelope containing the sticky lid. "But this one," she continued softly, "was not sealed by such steady hands. Whoever opened the fete jar lacked patience. They tore away the ribbon and pressed the lid too loosely afterward. A nervous person, perhaps. Someone acting in haste." Lily watched, wide-eyed. "Do you know who did it, Miss Marple?" "Not yet, my dear, but I know who didn't. and sometimes that is more important. When Lily had gone, Miss Marple sat alone by her window, listening to the first drops of rain tapping on the glass. In her mind, the puzzle was beginning to form its pattern. The poison had been administered quietly, deliberately, not for gain, but for something far more human. Resentment, fear, pride, the woods, the brooch, the bottle, the frightened maid, all threads of the same design. And somewhere in that design was a man who thought himself clever, who believed that kindness could be worn like a mask. Miss Marple smiled faintly as thunder murmured over the hills. She had met his kind before. They always underestimated the power of an old woman's curiosity, and her memory for the smallest, most inconvenient details. The rain continued through the night, a slow, steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of the cottages and turned the paths of Little Brinford into dark ribbons of mud. Miss Marple, lying awake in her small, neat bedroom, listened to it with the patience of one who knew that truth, like a seed, sometimes required a storm before it surfaced. She rose early, brewed her tea, and found her thoughts circling once again around Dr. Latham. The poison bottle, the late-night movements near the woods, the missing lid, all threads that seemed to converge at the same point. Yet Miss Marple, cautious as ever, reminded herself that certainty was the most dangerous illusion of all. By mid-morning, the weather had cleared just enough for Inspector Graves to resume his rounds. He stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, his expression grave. "Good morning, ma'am. Thought you'd like to know. Clara Briggs is awake and talking sense now. She's ready to give a proper statement." "How very fortunate," Miss Marple replied, setting down her teacup. "Might I come along? You know how sometimes a gentle ear can draw out what stern questions cannot." The inspector hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but only if you promise not to interrupt too much." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "My dear Inspector, I never interrupt. I merely observe out loud." They found Clara seated upright on her cot, her face still pale, but her eyes clearer. She looked embarrassed when she saw Miss Marple. "I didn't mean to cause all that trouble, ma'am. I was frightened, that's all." "Quite understandable, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But you can help us now, can't you? Just tell us what you saw." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "It was the night before the fete. I'd gone out to fetch water from the pump, and when I came back along the path near the orchard, I saw someone by the shed. At first I thought it was Mr. Lacey, but then I realized it wasn't. Too tall, and the way he moved was different, careful-like. There was a lantern on the ground and something glass in his hand. He poured a bit into a jar. At least that's what it looked like. And then he walked off toward the woods. I didn't wait to see more." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Could you tell who it was?" "I'm not sure," Clara said faintly. "He wore a hat, but—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "When he passed under the lantern light, I saw his sleeve. It had a patch, light brown with a tear near the cuff. I remember because Mrs. Harcourt had scolded Dr. Latham about that very thing the day before. Said he should learn to mend his own clothes." The inspector's eyes met Miss Marple's across the room. It was confirmation enough to darken suspicion into motive. But Miss Marple did not look triumphant, only thoughtful. "Thank you, Clara," she said softly. "You've been most helpful. Try to rest now." Outside, as they walked back toward the lane, Graves spoke in a low, urgent tone. "It fits, doesn't it? The debt, the argument, the opportunity, and now this sighting. She's put him there at the scene." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet I wonder, a clever man like Dr. Latham, trained in matters of life and death, would he really be so careless as to poison a jar in plain view of the servants' quarters. You think she's mistaken? I think, Miss Marple replied, that memory can be a tricky thing, particularly when fear is involved. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked down the street. Still, I should like to visit the good doctor once more. There's a small matter of conscience I'd like to discuss. Inspector Graves raised an eyebrow, but followed. The doctor's surgery was quiet, the air faintly smelling of antiseptic and damp paper. Dr. Latham looked up from his desk, surprise giving way to caution. Inspector, Miss Marple, twice in 1 week. I must be a most interesting man. You are, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Quite interesting indeed. I've been thinking about Mrs. Harcourt's death. Tell me, doctor, did you ever prescribe her arsenic? In the old-fashioned medicinal way, perhaps? He stiffened. Certainly not. Arsenic isn't used like that anymore. You should know better than to believe such gossip. Leave such gossip. Leave. Oh, I never believe gossip, Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. But I do believe in practicality. You see, arsenic is not an easy substance to come by these days, unless one happens to have professional access. His jaw tightened. Are you implying I stole poison from my own stores? I'm implying nothing, she said softly. Merely asking. Because you see, someone did use arsenic, and someone did enter Mrs. Harcourt's property the night before her death, and that someone was observed by a servant who thought, for a moment, that it was you. The doctor's face paled. That's absurd. I was home all that night. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Can anyone verify that? Latham's gaze flickered. My housekeeper was away visiting her sister. I was alone. Miss Marple sighed not unkindly. How unfortunate. Solitude is such a dangerous alibi, don't you think? The silence stretched taut between them. Finally, the doctor said in a low voice, If you truly believe I did this, then you're making a grave mistake. Miss Marple rose, her manner unhurried. Perhaps, but if so, it will reveal itself soon enough. I always find that truth resents being buried. It tends to wriggle its way up through the soil when least expected. Outside, the inspector muttered, He's hiding something. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly, but perhaps not what you think. He's frightened, certainly, but not of guilt. There's another layer here, one that touches pride more than fear. The next day brought another ripple through the village. Word spread that a bundle of letters had been discovered in Mrs. Harcourt's writing desk. Letters from Dr. Latham, discussing financial arrangements and promising repayment by the end of summer. But among them was one more recent, written not by him but to him, in Mrs. Harcourt's sharp, looping hand. If you cannot keep your secrets, Doctor, I will see to it that others learn them for you. Miss Marple read the copy Graves brought her. Her lips pursed. So she threatened him, he said. If that doesn't spell motive, I don't know what does. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, I can't help but think, if she meant to expose him, why invite him to the fete? Why risk public confrontation when private leverage would do? She looked up, her eyes glinting. Unless, of course, she wasn't planning to expose him at all. Perhaps someone else thought she was. That evening, as the village lights flickered one by one, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, her knitting needles motionless in her lap. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and still. The pieces were almost in place now. The frightened maid, the careless nephew, the proud doctor, the missing lid, the brooch, the letters. She could see the pattern forming, though the centre was not yet clear. Somewhere in that circle of fear and deceit, one person had made a fatal error. And Miss Marple, calm and patient as the turning clock, knew that soon, very soon, that error would show itself, not in words, but in the smallest, most human of gestures. The next morning brought with it a strange hush, as if the entire village were holding its breath. Even the sparrows seemed subdued, flitting between the hedgerows in quick, nervous bursts. Miss Marple noticed these small silences. They were the kind that came when truth hovered close, but had not yet landed. She went about her morning tasks calmly, watering her geraniums, trimming her roses, but her mind was busy, weaving the threads of her observations together. The letters had changed everything, not by confirming guilt, but by deepening the puzzle. The tone of Mrs. Harcourt's message to Dr. Latham had not been one of revenge, but of power, a power she intended to wield. And power, Miss Marple reflected, was a motive as potent as jealousy or greed. A knock came at her door, just as she was setting down her shears. It was Peter Lacey, pale and agitated, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his hat. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "may I come in? It's urgent." "Of course, dear boy," she said gently. "You look quite unwell. Sit down before you tumble." He obeyed, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. "It's about the letters, the ones they found in my aunt's desk. There's talk now that the doctor forged them, that he was trying to frame her somehow. Inspector Graves says it's nonsense, but everyone's whispering." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "And what do you think, Mr. Lacey?" He hesitated. "I don't know what to think, but I can't bear it. All this suspicion, this talk of poison and deceit. My aunt may have been a hard woman, but she didn't deserve this. And Dr. Latham, he's not a killer, I'm sure of it. I went to see him last night. He looked broken somehow. Said his career was ruined whether he was guilty or not." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "How very noble of you to visit him. Did you happen to notice anything unusual while you were there?" Peter frowned, thinking. Only that he seemed frightened. I asked him what he meant when he said he'd lost everything, and he just shook his head. Then, oh, this may be nothing, he said something strange. He said, "It's the past that poisons us, not the present." I thought it was just despair talking, but now I'm not sure. "Quite perceptive of you," Miss Marple murmured. "The past has a way of fermenting, you know, like fruit left too long in the sun. Tell me, do you recall your aunt having any dealings with someone beyond the village? A visitor, perhaps, or a correspondence not of the usual sort?" Peter shook his head. "None that I know of. She was very private, except—" He stopped abruptly. "Except?" He sighed. "There was a woman, a Miss Elaine Wilmot. She came to tea a few weeks ago. I thought it odd because Aunt Agnes never entertained strangers. She said Miss Wilmot was a friend from her school days, though she never mentioned her before. They spoke privately for nearly an hour, and afterward Aunt seemed unsettled, irritable. I asked who she was, but she snapped that it was none of my concern." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her tone remained mild. "How intriguing! Do you recall what Miss Wilmot looked like?" "Tall, fair, perhaps 40, well-dressed in a rather severe way. I think she said she was staying at the inn for a few days, but she left before I saw her again." "Thank you, Mr. Lacey. You've been very helpful." After he left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her teacup cooling beside her. The name Miss Wilmot tugged faintly at her memory. She had heard it once before, years ago, in connection with a scandal involving a nurse dismissed for misconduct. A nurse, perhaps from Dr. Latham's early days in practice. If so, the threads were tightening indeed. Later that afternoon, she paid a visit to the Rose and Crown. The landlord, Mr. Hutchins, was polishing glasses when she entered. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Can I get you something?" "Just a word, my dear Mr. Hutchins. I wonder, did a Miss Wilmot stay here about 3 weeks ago? Tall lady, fair hair, rather precise manner." He squinted, thinking. "Wilmot, you say? Aye, that rings a bell. Didn't stay long. Booked a room for 3 nights, but checked out after 1. Paid in cash, no trouble. Kept mostly to herself. Though I do recall seeing her with the doctor one evening. Quiet conversation by the garden gate. Thought it odd, at the time, her being a visitor and him not much for socializing." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "You've been most helpful." When she stepped back out into the sunlight, her heart was beating faster. If Miss Wilmot had known both Dr. Latham and Mrs. Harcourt, then she might well have been the link between them, the unseen hand that stirred the pot. But why return after all these years, and what did she gain from Mrs. Harcourt's death? That evening, Miss Marple wrote a brief note to Inspector Graves, requesting that he inquire into Miss Wilmot's whereabouts. By nightfall, he had returned with news. "You were right again, Miss Marple. Miss Wilmot's no stranger to Dr. Latham. She worked under him in a London hospital some years back. Dismissed for administering the wrong dosage to a patient, nearly fatal, they say. He defended her at the time, kept her out of prison, but lost his post over it. Seems she vanished afterward." "Until she came here," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. Graves nodded grimly. "We've sent word to London, but she's disappeared again. No sign of her since the day before the fete." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. "Oh, but she hasn't vanished, Inspector. Not really. She's merely changed her mask, as people so often do when running from consequence." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "It explains so much. The doctor's fear, Mrs. Harcourt's threat, even the choice of poison. So old-fashioned, so deliberate. A woman's touch, and one with knowledge of dosage and effect." The inspector frowned. "You think this Miss Wilmot killed Mrs. Harcourt?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she believed she was killing her past, but the past is never so easily silenced, especially when it leaves traces, like a silver brooch, a careless word, or a frightened servant's memory." That night the wind rose again, whispering through the trees that bordered the manor. Miss Marple sat by her lamp, knitting resting forgotten on her lap. The pattern was almost complete now, every thread drawn tight, every shadow taking shape. She could feel the truth pressing at the edges of her understanding, waiting to reveal itself in full. All that remained was one final confirmation, one gesture, one mistake, one moment of pride too strong to hide, and Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew exactly how to draw it out. The next day dawned pale and still, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath before something momentous. The air in Little Brinford carried a faint sharpness, as though the world itself were listening. Miss Marple, however, was not one to wait idly for revelation. She rose early, dressed neatly, and made her way to the manor under the polite pretence of bringing lilies for the late Mrs. Harcourt's parlour. In truth, her purpose was far more deliberate. She had decided it was time to let truth meet its reflection. Peter Lacey received her with the weary politeness of a man too young to be burdened by suspicion. The household, though subdued, was abuzz with quiet dread. Word had spread that the police were closing in on Dr. Latham, and the villagers, hungry for resolution, had begun to speak his guilt as fact. Miss Marple knew better. Certainty uttered too loudly was almost always misplaced. "I wanted to see the room where your aunt kept her desk," she said kindly when Peter offered tea. "It may sound peculiar, but I find that rooms tell stories if one only listens." He hesitated, then nodded and led her upstairs to Mrs. Harcourt's study. The air was heavy with the faint scent of lavender polish and old paper. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, turning the dust into golden motes that drifted lazily between them. Miss Marple walked slowly about, taking in the details, the neatly arranged correspondence, the unused fountain pen, the framed photographs upon the mantel. Her gaze settled upon one in particular, Mrs. Harcourt standing beside a younger woman, fair-haired, in a nurse's uniform. The inscription beneath read, "To dear Agnes, from Elaine, with gratitude and affection." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind quickened. Gratitude and affection, two sentiments that rarely survive the corrosion of time and resentment. "How curious," she murmured. "I suppose this was Miss Wilmot?" Peter looked surprised. "Yes, how did you know? I'd almost forgotten that photograph existed." "Oh, one never forgets faces, dear boy," Miss Marple said mildly, setting the frame down. "Especially faces that have learned to smile too precisely." As they spoke, a footstep sounded in the corridor. Dr. Latham appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his face drawn but composed. "Forgive the intrusion," he said stiffly. "Inspector Graves has summoned me to the constabulary. I thought I should offer my condolences once more before I go." Miss Marple turned to him with her most benign expression. "You're most considerate, Doctor. I wonder if you might spare just a few moments before you leave. There's something rather delicate I'd like to discuss, something that may help us all." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Of course." Peter excused himself, leaving the two alone. Miss Marple's tone when she spoke was light, conversational. "I was looking through Mrs. Harcourt's correspondence this morning. Such meticulous order. But one letter in particular struck me as unusual. It wasn't to you, Doctor, but to someone else entirely. A draft, unsigned. It spoke of a debt of the heart, and of making peace at last with an old wrong. That sort of language suggests a woman seeking closure, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Latham's fingers tightened slightly on his hat brim. "If you're implying she was sentimental about our past acquaintance, you're mistaken. She was far too proud for that." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But I wonder whose pride she threatened more, hers or someone else's. You see, I've been thinking about Miss Wilmot, or should I say, about the woman she used to be. A nurse dismissed in disgrace, a doctor who defended her, a wealthy patient who discovered their shared secret years later and used it to hold one in her power. How fortunate for that patient that both knew so much, and how unfortunate for the one who could not bear the weight of humiliation." The colour drained from his face. "You think I think you protected her once," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "And I think you have been protecting her still." He stared at her, breathing unsteadily. "You don't understand." "Oh, but I do," she said, her voice still calm. "Miss Wilmot was here. You met her, perhaps at Mrs. Harcourt's insistence. I imagine the conversation was strained. She was desperate, resentful perhaps. And Mrs. Harcourt, ever fond of wielding power, said something unwise. Later that night, Miss Wilmot slipped into the garden, poison in hand, and tampered with the preserve. You found out, of course. You always were observant, but it was too late to undo what she'd done, and so you tried to hide it, to spare her and yourself. His silence was a confession more eloquent than words. At last he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. She came to me the day before the fete, he said hoarsely. Said she needed to speak with Mrs. Harcourt. I didn't know she was planning anything, I swear it. But afterward, when the news came, I knew it must have been her. I found the empty bottle near the woods that night and buried it. I couldn't bear the thought of it all coming out again. The scandal destroyed my career once before. I couldn't face it again. Miss Marple regarded him sadly. You've been living under a shadow, Doctor, and you've mistaken concealment for redemption. It never works. Shadows only lengthen when the sun is denied. He looked up sharply. If what you say is true, then where is she now? Elaine's gone, vanished. I swear I've had no word from her since that night. She hasn't gone far, Miss Marple said softly. Fear never travels far. I expect she's still near Little Brinford, waiting for an opportunity to flee. But she'll make a mistake soon enough. Pride always insists on a farewell, even when silence would be wiser. Before either could say more, Inspector Graves appeared in the doorway. Doctor, we've had a report. The woman matching Miss Wilmot's description was seen boarding the morning train to London, but she left something behind at the inn. A trunk, locked. We've sent for the key, Miss Marple rose. How very convenient. I dare say what's inside will tell us everything we need to know. Graves turned to her, his brows raised. You mean proof, Inspector? Not merely that Mrs. Harcourt was poisoned, but that the act was meant to destroy more than one life. Miss Wilmot's vengeance was personal, yes, but her cruelty lay in letting the wrong person bear the weight of it. She glanced at the doctor. You must prepare yourself, Dr. Latham. The truth is rarely gentle. That afternoon, when the trunk was opened, it revealed what Miss Marple had anticipated. Bottles of medicinal arsenic, a faded nurse's uniform, and a stack of letters. Letters that laid bare a tangled history of jealousy, dismissal, and betrayal. The truth was cruel, but it was complete. Yet even as the village stirred with fresh gossip, Miss Marple remained composed. She knew that one final step remained. The true test was not in discovering guilt, but in revealing it properly, in allowing the guilty to reveal themselves. And for that, she had a plan already forming, as intricate and quiet as the lace she so often tatted by her window. The discovery of the trunk sent a ripple through Little Brinford that no Sunday sermon or scandal could match. By evening, word had spread that the London train had departed without its most wanted passenger. Miss Wilmot, nurse, fugitive, and now murderess, had slipped away into the fog somewhere between the station and the border of the next parish. Inspector Graves set men on her trail, but Miss Marple, watching from her cottage window, knew better. A woman like Elaine Wilmot, she thought, would not flee without watching the consequences of her own handiwork. Pride would not permit it. She would linger, unseen perhaps, but close enough to savour the chaos she'd sown. Pride was ever the last weakness to die. By morning, the village was a nest of whispers. Some claimed to have seen a figure near the woods at dawn. Others swore they'd heard a woman crying by the churchyard wall. Graves had taken Dr. Latham into custody for his own protection, though the look in the doctor's eyes as he was led away spoke of despair more than guilt. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with quiet deliberation, preparing for what she called in her mind the final conversation. It was time she decided to end the performance Miss Wilmot had so carefully begun. She wrote 2 notes that morning, one to Inspector Graves, asking him to bring Dr. Latham to the Harcourt Manor at dusk, and another addressed to Miss Elaine Wilmot, left quite conspicuously at the Rose and Crown. It read simply, "A final matter concerning Mrs. Harcourt's effects requires your attention. 6 o'clock. The study at the Manor." Miss Marple had no doubt the bait would be taken. The afternoon passed in deceptive calm. The sky was a dull pewter, the air heavy with the scent of coming rain. Miss Marple arrived early, ensuring the study was precisely as Mrs. Harcourt had left it, the faint scent of lavender polish still lingering, the photograph of Agnes and Elaine restored to its place on the mantel. She lit the lamp, adjusted her knitting bag beside the chair, and waited with the patience of one who understands that justice, like jam, must be prepared slowly if it is to set properly. At precisely 6, footsteps sounded in the hall. The door opened and a woman entered. She was tall, fair, her expression poised, but her eyes sharp with calculation. She wore a dark travelling cloak, damp at the hem, and though she smiled faintly upon seeing Miss Marple, the expression did not reach her eyes. "I must say, you're remarkably resourceful, Miss Marple," she said smoothly. "I wasn't aware my presence here was known." "Oh, my dear, your presence has been known for quite some time," Miss Marple replied gently. "The question was never where you were, but when you would decide to stop pretending you were gone." Elaine Wilmot's smile stiffened. "And may I ask why you've summoned me here? To scold me? I should think that's the inspector's duty." "I imagine the inspector will be here shortly," said Miss Marple, her voice mild. "But before he arrives, I wanted to speak with you privately. You see, I have a fondness for understanding human motives. Facts are dull things, dead things. Motives, on the other hand, are alive. They reveal far more than any confession." Elaine's eyes flickered toward the desk. "Then you already know everything, I suppose." "I know enough," Miss Marple said softly. "I know you came here to confront Mrs. Harcourt, because she had written to you, summoned you, really. She wanted to revisit an old grievance, perhaps to boast that she held your reputation and the doctor's in her hands. But I also know she underestimated how deeply resentment can ferment. When she spoke cruelly, as she was apt to do, you saw your chance. You thought, perhaps, that by silencing her you would free yourself from the shame she made you feel. So you slipped into the garden that night, poured a little something into the jar, and walked away, believing that justice, in your way, had been done." Elaine's composure faltered. "You make it sound almost poetic, Miss Marple. You must have quite the imagination." "Oh, imagination has very little to do with it," Miss Marple replied, eyes bright beneath her spectacles. "You see, one always leaves a trace of oneself behind. A broken clasp on a brooch, for instance. A nurse's habit of labelling bottles in a precise angular hand, identical to the one found on the trunk, or the faint scent of lavender soap on the glass lid of a jam jar. A scent quite distinct from Mrs. Cartwright's rosewater. Such tiny things, you see, so easily overlooked." For the first time, fear flickered in Elaine's face, quickly masked by defiance. "You can't prove any of that. You have no witness." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "But I do have one, my dear. You." A sound came from the hall, the creak of a floorboard, and then Inspector Graves entered with Dr. Latham close behind. Elaine's eyes darted to the door, then back to Miss Marple, who remained serenely seated. "Miss Wilmot," said the inspector quietly, I advise you to stay where you are." The woman's poise broke entirely then. "You don't understand," she cried, turning toward the doctor. "She was going to destroy you, Arthur. I couldn't let her do it again. I did it for you." Dr. Latham recoiled as though struck. "For me?" he whispered. "You've ruined me, Elaine. You've ruined everything." She took a step toward him, desperation twisting her features. "I loved you. I still do. I thought if she were gone." Her words dissolved into silence. The inspector moved forward, placing a steady hand on her arm. "That's quite enough, Miss Wilmot." Miss Marple rose quietly, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Love, my dear, can be a dangerous indulgence when mixed with pride. You sought to save the man you admired, but in truth, you sought only to save your own reflection in his eyes." Elaine trembled, her gaze darting to the photograph on the mantel. The two women smiling, frozen in friendship that had long since curdled into enmity. "She made me hate her," she whispered. "Every word, every look. It was like being back in that hospital, being judged, being pitied. I couldn't bear it." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though in sympathy. "Yes, I dare say she did make it very difficult. But hatred like love is rather like poison. Once opened, it spreads where it isn't meant to. It never stops where we intend." Elaine said nothing more as Graves led her away. The doctor remained motionless for a long moment, before speaking in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "How did you know she'd come?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, Doctor, vanity is a stubborn thing. Miss Wilmot needed an audience to the tragedy she had written. People always do." When they had gone, Miss Marple stood alone in the study, the evening light slanting through the curtains in long golden bars. She looked once more at the photograph on the mantel, then turned it face down with a sigh. Justice, she reflected, was rarely satisfying. It merely restored the balance that folly had disturbed. Outside, the wind stirred through the whispering woods once more, though the sound seemed softer now, as though the trees themselves had been appeased. Miss Marple walked home through the twilight, her small figure framed against the fading sky. She carried with her no triumph, only the quiet certainty that human hearts, though endlessly foolish, were endlessly familiar. And as she reached her garden gate, she murmured to herself, "It's always the little things, the things people never notice. They tell the whole story, if one only listens." The village of Little Brinford returned in time to its familiar rhythm, though the echoes of the tragedy lingered like faint perfume after a guest's departure. The fete grounds were cleared, the bunting folded away, and Mrs. Harcourt's name, once spoken with reverence or fear, was now uttered in low tones of pity. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, resumed her quiet life among her knitting needles and rose bushes, yet beneath her gentle exterior she carried the knowledge that every peaceful place concealed its storms, and that beneath even the loveliest facades human hearts beat with old unforgotten wounds. Elaine Wilmot was taken away under guard, her face pale and oddly serene, as though relief had followed confession. The newspapers called it the Whispering Woods poisoning, and printed long columns about her former disgrace, her connection to Dr. Latham, and her final act of vengeance. The London papers even called Miss Marple the spinster sleuth, which she found both flattering and mildly improper. "I only did what anyone might do," she said when asked about it. "One simply observes, that's all. Dr. Latham, though exonerated, chose to leave Little Brinford. His practice, burdened by scandal and whispers, could no longer thrive. Before departing, he paid Miss Marple a visit. He stood at her garden gate, hat in hand, the morning sunlight soft on his weary face. "You've given me back my life, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Though I can't say I deserve it," She smiled gently. "Few of us deserve anything, Doctor. Life is not so tidy as justice. But one must make what amends one can, and live honestly thereafter. That, I think, is the only redemption worth having." He hesitated, then nodded. "You're quite right. I shall try." When he was gone, Miss Marple looked after him with a faint sigh. "A pity," she murmured. "He was really a very decent man, merely weak, and weakness, I'm afraid, is often the seed of disaster when combined with loyalty." As for Peter Lacey, he inherited the manor, but soon announced plans to sell it and travel abroad. The memory of his aunt's death haunted him too deeply to remain. Before leaving, he stopped by Miss Marple's cottage to bid her farewell. "I don't think I'll ever understand why she had to die," he confessed, his voice heavy with youth's bewilderment at cruelty. "Because people seldom understand themselves, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Miss Wilmot's crime began long before she ever set foot in Little Brynford. It began the day she let resentment take root in her heart and mistook it for righteousness. You see, she didn't poison Mrs. Harcourt to kill her. She did it to kill her own shame. But such poisons always strike twice." Peter looked at her half in awe, half in sorrow. "I hope I never meet anyone like her again." "Oh, you will," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "We all do, sooner or later. They don't always kill with arsenic, you know. Sometimes they use words, or kindness, or silence. Human nature is very inventive in its cruelties. After he left, quiet returned to the village. The police withdrew, the gossip mellowed, and the summer days resumed their drowsy procession. Yet the woods, those whispering woods beyond the manor, seemed altered somehow. The villagers said they no longer heard the strange murmurs at night, that the trees had fallen silent at last. Miss Marple thought differently. They whispered still, she was sure of it, but now their voices spoke of closure, not guilt. One golden evening, she sat by her garden gate with her knitting in her lap, watching the children chase dragonflies across the lane. The scent of lilac hung in the air. Beside her teacup lay the silver brooch, the one she had found near the fete tables. It had been returned to her after the trial, no longer needed as evidence. She turned it over in her palm, the bent clasp catching the light. It was, she thought, a perfect symbol of the affair. Something once beautiful, now broken, yet still glimmering faintly in the sun. Her maid came out with the post just then, and Miss Marple smiled as she took the single envelope. Inside was a brief note from Inspector Graves. "Case closed. Your instincts, as ever, were the key. Little Brynford owes you its peace." Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it away in her knitting bag. "Peace," she murmured. "Such a fragile thing. It never lasts long. But it's lovely while it does." As twilight settled, she poured herself another cup of tea, and gazed toward the edge of the woods, now just a dark silhouette against the fading sky. Somewhere an owl called, soft and low. The world, she thought, was much like her garden, filled with beauty, tangled with weeds, and endlessly in need of gentle tending. And as she sipped her tea, the faintest smile touched her lips. For though the Whispering Woods murder was over, Miss Marple knew that human folly would bloom again somewhere else, just as surely as her roses would. And when it did, she would be ready, quiet, observant, and armed with nothing more dangerous than her unerring understanding of human nature. The evening breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the soft sigh of peace restored, and in that hush Little Brynford exhaled, the village once more at rest beneath Miss Marple's ever-watchful eye.